again. I'm Alistair McGrath, and I'm a professor of Christian theology at Oxford University. And in the next few articles, I'm going to explore with you some of the reasons that people give for finding Christianity credible and life-changing. Now, some of these are rational, based on the way in which faith makes sense of life, but some are linked to the human desire for meaning and significance, and others to the way in which faith builds personal resilience. Now, in this article, I'm going to explore one of these. I'm going to look at some ways in which Christians see their faith as helping us to make sense of the enigmas and the riddles of our experience. And the Christian faith here can be seen as lighting up the shadowy landscape of reality. It allows us to see things clearly as they really are. Now, the French philosopher Simone Weil came to a deep appreciation of the power of religious faith to make sense of our world. And here's what she had to say on this. She writes, "If I light up an electric torch at night, out of doors, I don't judge its power by looking at the bulb, but by seeing how many objects it lights up. The brightness of a source of light is appreciated by the illumination it projects on non-luminous objects. The value of a religious, or more generally a spiritual way of life, is appreciated by the amount of illumination thrown upon the things of this world." Now, if you're a scientist or a lawyer, you'll be familiar with this way of thinking. We judge a theory by how well it makes sense of what we observe and what we experience. And we ask, what is the big picture that makes most sense of the evidence? And in the end, the theory that's going to persuade a jury is going to be the one that weaves together as many as possible of the clues into a coherent narrative. And if there are several ways of interpreting this evidence, then the best theory is likely to be the one that's most comprehensive, the simplest, and the most elegant. It's all about looking for the big picture that makes sense of individual snapshots, or the grand narrative that makes sense of individual stories, or the grand theory that connects together the clues into a satisfying and coherent whole. So, what sort of clues are we talking about? Well, let's look at one of these. Very often we find that we dream of better worlds, worlds of justice, peace, and meaning. And very often the world we see around us just seems to fall short of our aspirations. We have these deep intuitions that things just shouldn't be like this. We observe suffering and we long for a world in which pain and suffering and death are no more. Surely, we say, there has to be a better world than this. Now, maybe these are just consoling thoughts designed to shield us from the harsh realities of life. And Sigmund Freud dismissed them, without any evidence, I have to say, as what he called wish fulfillments. But you see, these might be clues to what life is all about. They might point to a voice that's calling us, telling us of another land, a land that we once left behind and can find again, or a land that we might hope to inhabit in the future. Now, that was certainly the view of J.R.R. Tolkien, who you'll know as the famous author of The Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien held that the imagination was key to the meaning of life. And Tolkien interpreted the biblical idea of the image of God to mean that we all have some kind of homing instinct, if you like, an inbuilt sense of our true origins and destiny. We just know that this isn't the world that we're meant to inhabit. We're meant to live in a better world than this one. Now, that's what C.S. Lewis thought as well. And when Lewis was an atheist, he found himself yearning for a world of passion, beauty, and meaning, which his rather trenchant atheist worldview at that time told him did not and could not exist. Listen to what Lewis has to say about this dilemma. He writes, Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary, and nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. Now, Lewis's imagination told him there was a better world. His reason told him this was nonsense. As an atheist, Lewis believed he had to learn to live with the bleakness of a senseless world and his own pointless existence. But slowly and surely, Lewis realized that our longing for significance was a pointer to something that actually lay beyond the thresholds of our experience. It was a clue. It was a clue that suggested that human beings are created for something better than the world that we know. Now let's look at this in more detail. Lewis argues that most people, certainly including himself, experience a longing or a desire for something that simply cannot be had in this world. Now, some people, Freud for example, would argue this is just wishful thinking. But Lewis came to realize that there's another way of making sense of this feeling of longing, seeing it as a pointer towards another world. Now here's what Lewis himself had to say on this. He wrote, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." Now, Lewis argues that Christianity tells us a story and gives us a way of thinking that makes sense of things, including the deep human longing for beauty, significance, and meaning. And for Lewis, Christianity speaks of human beings having been created in order to know God and to come home to the new Jerusalem, which is where we really belong. We are in exile on earth, during which we anticipate our return to heaven. We're in captivity in Egypt, awaiting our entry into the promised land of milk and honey. And though we are physically located in one place, we anticipate, we mentally inhabit another place, which is where we believe that we truly belong. Now, there's a very important line of argument. Back in the 5th century, the theologian Augustine of Hippo summarized this idea in a famous prayer to God that you may well know. Here's what he said: "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." And you'll find this approach developed further in Tom Wright's interesting book, Simply Christian, in which he talks about what he calls 4 echoes of God's voice in the world, echoes that we hear and which cause us to rethink the way we see the world and ourselves. So Wright argues that our longing for justice, our quest for an authentic spirituality, our hunger for meaningful relationships, and our delight in beauty, these are all clues to who we really are and to what we're really looking for. They help us to work out who and what we are, and thus to find fulfillment. And above all, they help us to find God, who is the source of this voice and who is calling each of us. It's like the Old Testament story of the calling of Samuel, who heard God calling him but wasn't quite sure what this voice was or what to do about it. Now, for Wright and for Lewis, Christianity gives us a way of making sense of our world and of our experience, which helps us to understand who we really are and how we can become the people that we are meant to be. Now that, I think, is very important. But there are other reasons why people come to faith. And I'll talk about one of these in the next article, and that's the desire to find meaning in life. That's becoming increasingly important as a result of the many uncertainties that are around in the world today. So I look forward to exploring these with you in the next article in the series, and thank you so much for listening.